Vavasour House had the amiable gravity of an old friend who remembered better times and did not care to speak of them. Its rooms, though refurbished into a discreet harmony of pale walls and deeper curtains, retained the substance of previous decades. Carved mantels with gentle chips, mirrors with faint foxing, pilasters that knew how to bear weight. On that wet April evening, the house entertained a small gathering to preview an exhibition that was not strictly an exhibition, but an arrangement of prized possessions pressed into public view for reasons nobody meant to state outright. Lady Imogen Vavasour, in a gown of dove-grey silk that flattered an elegance she did not quite feel, stood at the heart of it with a hostess's habitual grace. She had the manner of a woman for whom beauty still mattered, but accounts mattered more. The collection, her late husband's, was arrayed in 2 rooms, lacquered cabinets, a few miniature bronzes, a pair of scrolls whose provenance could, if one were to listen to certain voices, be the subject of brisk debate. It was all quite tasteful. A small glass case had been placed on a plinth near the window. Inside, on velvet, lay a key. The key was the size of a child's thumb and perfectly carved in ivory, its shank composed of intertwined creepers, its bow a tiny wheel with 8 spokes. It had a light in it, the light ivory keeps when handled for years by someone who has not thought of elephants. Near it, a discreet card read, "The Ivory Key of Jinghao Temple, see a 17th century." A dealer with a pale tie and a sense of custody stood not far from it. Mr. Aubrey Kersey raised his glass and his eyebrows in one motion whenever anyone came near the case, and he had a way of making conversation into a preface for a receipt. "Exquisite," he murmured to Lady Imogen and to the room, which seemed to accept the compliment without endorsing it. One cannot overstate the rarity. Opposite him, Dr. Oliver Montfort, whose body had arranged itself long ago into austerity, kept his cane beside him as if it were a marking staff. "On the contrary," he said mildly, "one sometimes can. One does. The iconography of the bow is not consistent, and your date is optimistic." "Scholars," said Mr. Kersey, turning an unctuous smile upon Lady Imogen, "must be allowed their joys." "It would be a pity," Lady Imogen said, with that patient equanimity which makes a rebuke into a courtesy, "if we were to argue in front of the key. It might take sides." "It would," said Clement Dane, who produced plays and wore his hair as if he were producing it too. "Choose the critic over the impresario, and that would be the end of civilization." Serena Vale, the actress whose profile caused people to adjust their posture, laughed softly. She wore black, which on some women is an assertion. On her, it was a veil. She had spent the first half-hour in a composed tour of the rooms, accepted a glass from the butler, with a grateful nod that made him her ally, and now stood at a slight angle to Clement Dane, not declaring anything but not denying it. "There are worse ends," she said, "than a key that keeps its own counsel." The butler's name was Dodsley. He had the aspect of a man who would not be astonished at anything after 30 years in service, but who would prefer not to be tried. His quiet traverses of the carpet settled the room like punctuation. When he paused near the glass case, it was with a little fold of his hands that would have satisfied St. James himself. One felt the object had been safely passed among older, steadier hands before it came here to be examined by clever ones. General Sir Hector Darrow, big and bluff in a way that was not quite conscious, moved towards the key with the directness of a man who had got through more doors than he cared to recall. His daughter, Rosamond, slender and prettily uncommitted, drifted after him, smiling at those who looked as if they might demand it. "So that's it," Sir Hector said, peering. "Damnably small for a thing with a legend." "Legends often are," said Dr. Montfort. "Do you suppose it opens anything?" Rosamond asked, eyes bright under a brim that owed nothing to utility. "Only men's purses," said Mr. Kersey, and looked for appreciation. From the corner near the hearth came the banker's tone, slightly muffled by good breeding. Sanford Pike had a way of leaning against furniture as if he meant to buy it. "What one requires," he said, "is an object with charm and a narrative. The American institutions have grasped as much. A new wing is built upon a story well told." "On a story well sold," Clement Dane amended, with a friend's amiability that concealed its edge. "We are all in trade now." Lady Imogen's personal secretary, Miss Beatrice Wetherill, anchored her presence by the arrangement of papers upon a side table. She was one of those women who seem to have been formed by the furniture they keep straight. She had the quiet watchfulness of a person who knows what sits in which drawer and why. When she spoke, it was only to say, "The catalogue card is temporary, Mr. Kersey. We shall wish to agree upon the wording." "Of course," said Mr. Kersey, very smooth. "Of course." If there were cracks, they showed not as quarrel, but as fastidiousness. It was in the slight crispness of Lady Imogen's smile when Sanford Pike named American institutions, and in Dr. Montfort's spare courtesy to Mr. Kersey, and in the brief way Rosamond's gaze slid from Serena Vale and paused on Clement Dane, and then away again. It was in the fact, unremarked but present, that Benedict Vavasour, Lady Imogen's stepson, had not yet come into the room, though the invitation bore his signature. When at last he did appear, slipping in by the far door as if he had not meant to be seen doing so, he looked like a man whose sleep had not settled and whose hands, fine and clever, had long ago learned to keep still. "My apologies," he said, and to his stepmother a glance that was at once dutiful and elsewhere. "The rain at the square is constitutionally heavier than anywhere else in London. Has Mr. Kersey been persuasive?" "Mr. Kersey is never otherwise," Lady Imogen said. "Benedict, Dr. Montfort conceives we have mislabelled the bow." Benedict Vavasour approached the case with a faint half-smile that might or might not have been for the key. "Do we," he said to Dr. Montfort, "mislabel anything else? My father mislabelled half his friendships and 3/4 of his dinners. The cabinets are by Gomme," he added, glancing at the stands. "He thought they were Gillot's." "The difference is substantial," Dr. Montfort said. "It always is," Benedict returned, and lifted his eyes to the dealer. "Is the difference in price equally so?" "The distinction will be reflected," Mr. Kersey replied, "in any figure I might venture, but I would not dream of anticipating Lady Imogen's wishes." Clement Dane, with an agreeable groan, said, "I do wish someone would anticipate mine. Sanford, we require an angel with a temperate halo. The second act falls to the ground without Serena's entrance, and the entrance requires a door, and one cannot simply indicate a door. One must open it." "Dear man," Serena said, the kindness of humor in her voice, "I will open anything you put in front of me." Rosamond glanced at her father almost invisibly, and Sir Hector, who had an air for the movement of troops but not for the drift of young women, said, "Quite so. Splendid." Dodsley, pausing by the chimney-piece, spoke in his soft, trained way. "Her ladyship has asked that the case be covered at 10 precisely." He did not look at the key but at the room as if he were reminding it to be polite. "In accordance with her ladyship's usual practice." "Dodsley," Lady Imogen said, "you are kind. Miss Wetherill, would you see that Mr. Pike receives a summary of the valuations Mr. Kersey has provided?" Miss Wetherill assented. "To Mr. Kersey, if you would oblige me." She held with 2 fingers a paper that had been folded and unfolded often, and one could not tell whether the many creases were of necessity or habit. Benedict Vavasour had not moved from the case. He stood mildly apart, as if the distance were a convenience. He said, without turning, "Dr. Montfort, you lunched with my father on the day he acquired this, did you not?" "I did," Dr. Montfort said. "At the Athenaeum, he was in a mood of triumph. They are often unwise." "And he told you," Benedict went on as if considering a painting, "that the key was blessed by a monk who had never seen an elephant." "Something of the sort," Dr. Montfort acknowledged. "Your father preferred stories that could not contradict him." "So do dealers," Benedict said, and at that Mr. Kersey's smile brightened in gentle suffering. Sandford Pike crossed to Lady Imogen and stood slightly too close, not uncomfortably, but with intention. "If I may be frank," he said in a tone designed to suggest that he usually was not, "you have, if I may say, assets that would be more appreciated where distance erases certain native scruples. There is a museum on Fifth Avenue that would pay well," Lady Imogen supplied, "because someone must. Honor the collection," Sandford Pike amended. "It would be seen." "It is being seen," Lady Imogen said, without moving her eyes from the door through which people would later quietly go. "It is being judged," Mr. Kersey murmured, hardly audible, and then as if to make amends, "by connoisseurs." Serena Vale had drawn nearer the window and looked down at the square, where the rain made soft confetti of the street lamps. She turned, with a thoughtful slowness, and addressed nobody in particular. "What would it open?" "The Temple's reliquary," Mr. Kersey said at once. "Nothing at all," Dr. Montfort murmured, "for 200 years. "The safe," said Rosamond, half in jest and half not. "It would be delicious if Dodsley used it to lock us all in." Dodsley inclined his head. "We have never found ourselves in need of that, miss." "Nor of an American museum," Benedict said, rather more quickly than the words required. Lady Imogen gave him a look that was almost maternal. "Let us be gentle," she said, which is what women say when a man is about to be cruel. The hour came on. The light changed in the room with the modesty of the London evening. The conversation, which had drifted among objects and people in equal measure, thinned. Names were exchanged with small exhalations of relief. Dodsley drew near the case with its velvet and that pale thing upon it. He had in his gloved hand a square of dark cloth, and with a movement that had all the dignity of concealment, he placed it over the glass. It was not that the key vanished, rather that it became private again. Clement Dane said something about rehearsal. Serena's smile made an agreement of it. Sandford Pike took from Miss Wetherill the folded valoration and slipped it into his inner pocket, where it went, one felt, not to lie down, but to stir. Dr. Montfort and Mr. Kersey exchanged farewells with only the gentlest particles of frost. As they moved to go, the rain went on saying what the rain always says, which is that London is old and will outlast one's nerves. Lady Imogen stood and received, and people left her in the stately way people leave a woman who has learned the trick of not letting them see inside her house. In the interval between the last guest's departure and the silence that followed, Benedict Vavasour crossed quickly to the covered case and, with one finger, traced the line of the glass beneath the cloth as if reassuring himself of its shape. "Don't," Lady Imogen said very quietly. He drew his hand away. "I only wanted," he said, "to be certain it was still there." "It is always there," she said. Then, after a little moment in which a less well-bred woman might have sighed, "until it is not." Dodsley, who had come back as if he had forgotten something, looked at them both and did not speak. He carried, tucked against his sleeve, a leather-bound book with thin pages. It might have been a wine ledger. It might have been, more simply, a list of habits. In the big panelled hall beyond, the door to the study stood ajar. From within came the dry rustle of Miss Wetherill's papers. She had the light on her shoulder rather than the page, as if she preferred to keep the words veiled. When Lady Imogen passed the door, she paused. "Beatrice," she said, "see that the case is checked at 10 and again at past. Then ask Dodsley to put it to bed." "Yes, my lady," Miss Wetherill said. Her eyes lifted once, quickly, and dropped again. The sound of the rain filled the gap her silence left. Upstairs, a clock struck the quarter in a discreet tone, one that had learned its manners from the family. It occurred to nobody to count the chimes. They were, like most things in that house, part of a ritual one did not notice until it altered. The evening peeled away in silken layers. Motors murmured at the curb. One by one, the guests were received back into the night with umbrellas held like discreet parasols against the fine rain. The general, upright as a pike, allowed the footman to find his hat, and murmured something to Lady Octavia about empire and sentiment. Dame Sybil, wrapped in chinchilla, bestowed a smile on Felix Armitage sufficient to nourish his genius for a week. Iris, with a hand on her mother's arm, said she would see Mrs. Bracknell's niece to her car, and drifted out like a pale leaf. In the long gallery, the colored lamps were going down. The Indian casket, with its inlay of mother-of-pearl, sat once more on its stand. The ivory key, small as a lady's finger and faintly yellowed, its wards cut in the shape of a lotus, lay on its velvet pad. Mr. Pottle, who had attended many charities and scandals in Lady Octavia's service, stood square as a doorpost at the threshold and watched the thinning of the company with an expression that was neither approval nor concern. Dr. Imogen Vale hovered to one side, her spectacles catching the last light. "Before its return to the safe, Lady Octavia," she said. "Might I, very briefly?" "Imogen, of course." Lady Octavia's fatigue lent her voice a certain grace. "Mr. Pottle will stand by." Aubrey Kestrel, who had remained stubbornly present, smoothed a glove against his palm and made the little shape with his mouth that suggested a smile without commas. "An admirable precaution," he observed, glancing at Pottle. "One wouldn't want a museum piece to meet with an accident on a night of display." "Nor a dealer to sign a certificate against his conscience," said Dr. Vale without heat. "Conscience," murmured Kestrel. Such a heavy, trifling word. Felix had paused by them with the uncertainty of the very young man at the edge of necessity. "It looked finer under the colored lamps than it deserved," he said too quickly. "Don't you think? The yellow made a tone with the old varnish." "No," said Dr. Vale. "And yes," added Kestrel. "There speaks the painter." "Mr. Pottle," said Lady Octavia, with that light pressure that comes from long governance, "at 11 the cases are to be covered. See that the key and the casket go to the study safe. I'm to have my list from Miss Dalrymple before I go up." "Very good, my lady." They drifted apart. The general was gone. Dame Sybil's car purred away. The gallery breathed, found its old hush. Dr. Vale, with Pottle beside her, examined the casket with a tender exactitude, lifting the lid, noting something under her breath and making a brief correction to a card. Kestrel, after waiting long enough to make the waiting noticeable, made a small quotation from Pope and bowed himself out. Felix hesitated. Iris, returning with damp lashes and a rebellious chin, said something to him that made him color and look pleased. It was all extremely quiet. At 11, Pottle drew the slender covers over the cases, his movements exact and contemplative. He took up the ivory key in his neat fingers, slipped it into its linen sleeve, and carried both key and casket through the swing door to the heavy, book-scented air of the study. The safe, set behind paintings of bad horses, yielded to the combination with a resigned sigh. He placed the casket inside. He hesitated, looked at the little sleeve in his hand, and, with a butler's conservatism about routine, put the key back into the velvet-lined drawer of the side table in the gallery where it had lain all afternoon. For the lady to see, as Lady Octavia had said earlier, intending to bring it through with the last tray. In the kitchen, the staff were at their cocoa. Miss Dalrymple bent over her ledger. The house fell into that pleasant lull when it remembers its own furniture. It was Elsie who went back to close the curtains in the morning room. The morning room stood between the long gallery and the small music salon and was used by day for flowers. She moved round the bowls, lifted a stem or two, and found the door to the salon standing an inch open. A lamp glowed there, low and steady. She tapped and looked in. At first it was merely a figure in a chair, as if one of the guests had come back to sit out a headache. The pose was decent. A hand lay on the chair arm, the fingers a little curved, precisely as Elsie had seen them on gentlemen in prints. The face, tilted, was abstracted, as if it listened to a very distant string quartet. "Sir," said Elsie. No answer. She took a step. A glass lay on the carpet, quite unshattered on its side. The little table beside the chair had a square shape without the weight that had been on it earlier. There was the imprint of a velvet pad and nothing upon it. On the floor at the chair's foot, something pale and small had fallen, a sleeve of linen with its mouth parted. Elsie's mouth opened in automatic politeness to excuse herself. The figure did not adjust itself to be polite. It did not adjust itself at all. She drew back, absurdly careful not to touch anything, then ran, a quiet, frightened patter in the corridor, and fetched Pottle. Pottle came with the measured speed of a man who has been told the very worst once or twice and learned to move like a clock. He bent, looked, touched nothing and no one. Aubrey Kestrel, elegantly seated and very much at his ease, was entirely dead. "Don't touch the glass," Pottle said to Elsie, who was holding herself together with her apron. "Stand quite still." "Thank you." He walked across to the gallery, opened the side drawer, and saw the dark velvet without the ivory. He closed it gently. He looked at the small sleeve on the carpet, and then at the dead man's hand. There was the very faintest alteration, as if some small object had been held and then let go when it was too late to plot the consequence. He went to the telephone and asked for Lady Octavia. She came with her daughter after her like a thought, and stood, very straight, her pearls making a discreet shine in the lamplight. She looked once, and not again. "Pottle." "Yes, my lady." "Who knows?" "Elsie and myself. Miss Dalrymple is in the office." "We shall ring Dr. Steele and the Yard," said Lady Octavia, with a steadiness that would do for many stages. Quietly. "Iris—" "I'm not going to scream, Mamma," said Iris. "Don't let anyone else see." Outside, the rain ran in a small, deliberate line along the sill. Somewhere in the house, a clock nearly struck 12 and then, as if thinking better of it, held its tongue. Alleyn, with Fox moving large and tactful at his shoulder, came into the music room as one enters a church after a service that has ended badly. The silence had thickened. It held the ghost of a cadence, as if the last quiet chord was still suspended somewhere in the coffered ceiling. The young man at the grand remained in his seat, head tilted upon his own shoulder, hands lax upon his knees. A fall of black hair eclipsed the neat line of his temple. The soft pedal was still depressed. Alleyn could see the small ivory knob caught half down like a held breath. The doctor, a round-shouldered pink gentleman with an apologetic aspect, stood aside and stared at his own folded hat. Lady Honoria Seven, without her earlier sparkle, had assumed a sort of hostess's bereavement, the more effective for being controlled. Her daughter was near the French windows, pale in a pale dress, her hands interlaced as if praying for something nameless. The others arranged themselves with the instinctive choreography of their kind. A famous actor, a little forward, a critic with her pen-shaped mouth compressed, a soldier with his chin high, a composer playing the mournful modern with admirable discretion. "Inspector," said the constable at the door, quite softly, as if the room would resent full tones. "Dr. Pember says—" "I know Dr. Pember," said Alleyn, and shook the doctor's hand. "You've done what was needful." The doctor inclined his head toward the still figure. "I fancy," he murmured, "that we may say heart, if we must say anything at all. There is no mark, no struggle." He sat down. He must have sat down, and simply— He lifted one hand in an ineffectual little sketch of extinction. Alleyn's gaze had gone to the fall-board and the dull sheen of the keys. The topmost octaves had the faint bloom on the ivory that comes only with habitual use. There was a single dark line across middle C where some evening's candle had bled. He took a step closer without touching, and noticed a small object lying near the balance rail, absurdly domestic in that sea of refined machinery. A key, carved in ivory, no bigger than a postage stamp, with a miniature bow scraped smooth by fingers, long dead. It lay as if someone had set it there to be admired, and then forgot it. He straightened and looked across at a vitrined cabinet on the opposite wall. In it, he saw a fan mounted like the wings of a moth, a lacquer box, seed pearls folded into a glove, a theater program from an age of whiskers and roses, and a little velvet stand with a card that read in the house's own careful hand, Ivory Key, Portuguese India, CD 1700. The stand was empty. Fox's eyes, following his, made a brief, slow journey back to the piano, and then, with their peculiar bovine gentleness, took in the room. "Lady Seven," Alleyn said. He went to her with a formality that suggested condolences rather than police business. "I'm sorry to intrude on such a moment. Will you forgive me? I must ask that everyone remain for a little while. The servants too, if you please." "Of course," she said, and with a vestige of her earlier grace nearly made it sound like a favor to all concerned. He saw the butler and True at her elbow, the professional gravity never quite concealing a man's anxiousness when the house is in peril of disgrace. True's eye moved past Alleyn to the piano and back again with a flicker that would have been contempt in any other man. The rhythm of a household had been broken. Trays would be delayed. The kitchen would wait for orders that did not come. Alleyn, who had learned to read domestic unease as others read newspapers, stored the knowledge without comment. Dr. Pember spoke again, fidgeting with his hat. "He asked for water," he said. "In the interval. True brought it. There is the glass. I mention it because, well, one mentions these things. But I think—" He glanced at Lady Seven, checked himself, and subsided. On a low table, a glass stood solitary, abandoning a ring upon the polished wood. Alleyn came near it, bent, and did not touch. There was a faint crescent of color on the rim, coral and luminous, too feminine for the dead man's mouth. The water itself lay flat as if bored by its own presence. From the far end of the room, the composer, Mr. Quine, Fox breathed into his ear without needing to be asked, watched with the expression of a man who has begun to write the first paragraph of a memoir and wonders if he should be ashamed. The actor, Sir Basil, had attempted comfort with a series of small, perfectly pitched phrases and now stood entirely still, as if mourning were a tableau. Alleyn moved without visible purpose and yet with extreme economy. He noted the folded program on the music desk, a penciled tick against Chopin and something like the ghost of a question mark next to Debussy. He noticed that one of the French windows stood open a half-inch, the room's own attempt at decency, and that a faint whiff of orris powder had insinuated itself past the heavier scent of hothouse lilies. He observed the daughter's hands, which were not the hands of a girl who plays, and the critic's mouth, which was. "Fox," he murmured, "ask them not to telephone." He added with apology to Lady Seven, "The line may be needed. True will arrange a room where we may sit more comfortably in a little while." True bowed from the neck, already adjusting the remainders of the evening to this new order. In the doorway the housekeeper had appeared, a respectable shadow. She looked at the piano and then quickly away, as if the sight were indecent. Alleyn came back to the instrument. He paused for a long moment, looking not at the young man, but at the small ivory key that had strayed from its history. Then he turned away as if from a sight too intimate, and his glance took the room once more, tallying faces as a librarian tallies books. "Thank you," he said to no one and to all. "If you will be patient with me, we shall not keep you long." They believed him because he made it sound possible. And yet, in the minute that followed, the silence seemed to deepen, as if the house itself held its breath for what would be asked next. Alleyn began with the courtesies. Lady Sybil Ashcroft received him in a morning room that had survived the house's other renovations, as though sheer taste had been let alone. There were white azaleas in a shallow bowl and a small, very good Vermeer sketch, and the clock spoke decorously to itself. She stood, not quite leaning against the mantel-shelf, one hand in possession of the other. "You must forgive the household," she said. "Phipps has sent for coffee and quiet, which is all one can offer. Inspector, no, you are a chief inspector, aren't you? You shall ask what you must." "Thank you," said Alleyn. "The quiet will be most useful." She inclined her head. "Sir Julian was a very old friend." Alleyn let the name find its own level in the room. "The Chinese room was not often used, you told my sergeant." "Not at all, unless we had reason." A glance, so slight it might have been at the azaleas, toward the far door. "Tonight's reason was Sir Julian's. He wished to produce his treasure as if from a conjurer's sleeve. He could be a little theatrical with old things. He promised us a scroll. The key, I understand, is missing." "Yes," said Alleyn. "The ivory key from the vitrine. It is more unusual than useful, I gather." "Quite the contrary. It opens the lacquer cabinet." Julian was very pleased with the conceit. A key carved from tusk to garter thing on paper. She paused. "You will have to ask about the cabinet's contents. You will find that they concern more than art. Financially." She produced a smile that acknowledged both his tact and the unavoidability of the question. It is hardly a crime to say that Sir Julian's regard ranged over both canvases and cheques. I am a widow with a house that leaks. He was fond of the house. Her eyes met his, level and accompanied by a trace of audacity. "Fond of the house." "And of its company," said Alleyn gently. She did not reply to that, but he saw colour draw itself in very slightly at her cheekbones. "We all waited for him to make his little performance," she went on even again. "We waited longer than was comfortable. It became embarrassing. I sent Phipps to find him. There is nothing theatrical about being found." "Did you see the key during the evening?" "It was in its case when we came down. Dr. Fielding asked a question about its age. She is our scholar." Mr. Vale touched the glass. "He is a child in museums. After the first course, Julian suggested we take the thing out and unlock the cabinet after coffee. I suppose—" "No, I cannot suppose." He left her with coffee and took Crispin Vale at the window of the studio that had been given him as a compliment and converted into a declaration. The artist had a cigarette that moved like punctuation, and fingers stained a respectable black. "You've the look of a man who hates keys," Alleyn remarked. "I've the look of a man who hates cages," said Vale. "Anything that locks a picture away should be burnt. If the key has gone on a spree, I wish it joy." Alleyn looked at the trestles, at a canvas whose blue was too honest to be tactful. "You had a quarrel with Sir Julian in the afternoon." "Art," Vale said, and let the words sit like a prop on a mantelpiece. "He wished to bring out a dead Chinese and sell him off bit by bit. I think scholarship should not be cut with a butter knife." "You were in the Chinese room?" "I wandered. One does. The room is a set. I went in because Miss Ashcroft was playing." He snapped his fingers softly, as if at a line forgotten. "Debussy, something with a glass surface. I saw the cabinet like a little temple and the key showing off in its cage. You'll say I touched the glass." "I did. I am tactile, Chief Inspector. It is the only honest vice." "You have many dishonest ones?" "None that would interest you," said Vale and smiled. "Ask Captain Darton. He lives in the Pragmatic." He found Dr. Imogen Fielding in the library, where she had retreated, it seemed, to be anxiously exact. She had the absorbed air of a woman accustomed to talking to objects that never contradicted her. "I asked about the key," she said at once, before he had framed the question. "The carving is late 19th century export work. The wards are clever, too clever for ostentation. It is, I suppose, a pretty irony to use elephant for paper. I did not handle it." "You were to catalogue the cabinet." "In the morning," she said. "Sir Julian promised. He said I should have the scroll for an hour if I promised not to lecture him during dinner. I did not lecture him." She lifted her eyes. He had a way of humoring knowledge. It put one in the position of a bore at a good party. You saw him after dinner? He left before dessert. He tapped the table and said, "We shall have a ceremony in 5 minutes." He took Phipps into his confidence, which is the only safe place to put a confidence in this house. A quick, guilty look. I oughtn't to say that. It may be very useful, said Alleyn. Did you notice anything in the Chinese room when you went in with the others? The smell, she said, and then flushed. No, this house smells of beeswax and lavender. In that room there was a dryness. Dust, perhaps. I'm being fanciful. Captain Darton stood stiffly in a little anteroom like a man who has drilled himself to wait. He was clean about the eyes and very careful with his speech. I didn't go near the cabinet, he said. I'm afraid I don't know a scroll from a bolster case. I played a rubber with Mr. Vale and Miss Gray, if that helps. After that, I telephoned the club. Sir Julian was a friend? Alleyn asked. A benefactor, said Darton, and the word cost him. Not to me. Well, he was good for the county, if you take my meaning. As for me, I'd no claim on him. Claims can be invented, Alleyn observed. Not by me, said Darton. I hold my tongue until I mustn't. That's all I can tell you. When Alleyn returned to the hall, the house was listening. Somewhere, a pianoforte key was pressed by someone's restless hand and released again, the one note a faint ivory plink in a pause. He thought of the empty mount in the vitrine, and of a room that had altered its own air, and of a butler whose discretion was sufficiently admired to be resented. He asked for Mr. Phipps. It was past midnight when Alleyn asked, very gently, if he might have a word with the household below stairs. The request, couched almost as apology, was conveyed by the butler and met with the sober gravity of people to whom night duties are as elastic as conscience. The house seemed to draw in upon itself. In the service corridor the lamps were shaded, and beyond them a little glow leaked from the kitchen where someone had put a kettle back to simmer, more for steadiness than need. They came one by one and sat, when bidden, upon the edge of a wooden chair in the housekeeper's room. The butler, Mr. Reeves, stood until Alleyn asked him to be seated. He refused a second time and remained upright, slim as a rapier, hands joined, eyes level with a picture rail. Mrs. Trent, the housekeeper, carried her key ring like an emblem. The under-housemaid, Ivy, folded her fingers into her apron and tried not to look at the inspector, and looked all the more. Alleyn, with an inclination of the head as if to a hostess, said, I shall be brief. I dislike intruding upon anyone's sleep, but routine is eloquent, and I am ignorant of yours. Reeves seemed to relinquish a fraction of stiffness. Sir, the routine, for instance, of coffee after music, Alleyn went on. How was it served tonight? In the music room, sir. A silver tray, 2 demi-tasses from the Sèvres set and 4 from the modern porcelain. Cream jug and sugar, though the ladies do not invariably take them. The liqueurs upon a separate tray. Cigarettes in the blue Wedgwood. Matches to hand. And decanters. Brandy, sir, and a very small sherry. The brandy was touched. The sherry, I think not. Mrs. Trent's keys chimed softly. And the ashtrays, she said, with that busy sorrow of women whose business it is to amend after drama, were attended to between courses. Alleyn listened to the silence that followed. And the little key, he said, as if the matter were incidental to comfort, the one of ivory that opens the Florentine casket on the pianoforte. Where is it usually kept? Reeves's eyelids did not move, but the pause was measurable. On a silk braid behind the mantel clock, sir. And tonight? It was upon the music stool when I went to extinguish the sconces. Mrs. Trent's keys chimed a shade louder. Mr. Reeves brought it back at once, she said, with a glance that was both rebuke and allegiance. Of course, said Alleyn. Do you know who may have moved it? No, sir. There was a gap through which one could, with tact, plot the line of a secret. Alleyn did not force it. He let the silence sit, companionable, almost domestic. Reeves moved first, very slightly. "It is not my place," he said, "to attach significance to trifles. But the key, being ornamental, is sometimes admired." Guests lean. "Indeed," said Alleyn. "And the casket," Reeves breathed. "Shut, sir. Not locked." "Ah." He looked to Mrs. Trent. "The flowers," he said. "I noticed the lilies were newer than the freesias. Whose hand?" "Mine, sir," said Mrs. Trent, quick and flurried to be useful. "Her ladyship does not favour strong scent in the evening. The lilies were in the hall all day. She asked me, after dinner, to change them. I did so at 9:05. "After dinner," Alleyn repeated, "and before the music began." "Yes, sir." "Thank you," said Alleyn. He turned to Ivy. "You were in the music room earlier," he said, as if it had been told to him by the room itself. She started. "Only with the duster, sir. Mr. Reeves had me do the top of the pianoforte, very careful. Only the cloth, sir. I never touch the keys." "Of course. The keys are tuned on Thursdays," Alleyn observed. "Yes, sir," Ivy whispered, grateful to be given her own law. "Mr. Lambert comes of a Thursday. He don't like fingerprints. He says they dull." "Mr. Lambert is the tuner?" "Yes, sir." "And this evening, before the guests arrived, did you notice the fallboard up or down?" Ivy thought, closed her eyes, saw herself, and opened them. "Down, sir." "Mr. Reeves, he always has it down till the last." Reeves conceded a curt nod. "It is the practice, sir. The instrument is not for display." "And yet," Alleyn said, "after the music, when you extinguished the sconces, you found the ivory key upon the music stool." "Yes, sir." "It had not been there before?" Reeves's hands, perfectly still, betrayed themselves by a tightening at the knuckle. "No, sir. I would have seen it." "Thank you," said Alleyn again. He let the kettle murmur in the adjoining kitchen fill the pause. "Mrs. Trent, about the clock on the mantel. Who winds it?" "Mr. Reeves, sir. At 10:30, always." Reeves inclined his head. "It keeps her ladyship's time. And tonight? I had not yet wound it when the alarm was given." The butler's voice did not change, but the word alarm was set down carefully, as if not to disturb the dust of respectability. Alleyn considered him. "No other alterations of routine?" "A window," Mrs. Trent said reluctantly. "I did not mention it. The left casement. It is generally latched. It was not. The night air is—" She stopped herself. "I put it fast at 10. "Thank you," said Alleyn, and to Ivy, "And you saw no one before the music with the casket?" Ivy swallowed, made a little movement, and was still. "Sir," she said, "I am to take no notice." Alleyn waited. It was Ivy who could not bear the waiting. "I heard a voice," she said. "Only in the passage, sir, by the door. Soft-like when you read. I thought it was Miss—" She bit the name in two and coloured. "I thought it was the secretary, sir, but I didn't see. Only her shoes, perhaps." Quiet, shoes. Mrs. Trent said sharply, "Ivy." "It is helpful," Alleyn said, and tempered the words with a faint smile that acknowledged both their scruple and their importance. "You've all been more than kind." He rose, and they rose with him, a small ceremonial, and he left them to their kettle and the soft rearrangement of their world. In the corridor, the lamp made a conceit of his shadow, elongating it in the direction of the music room. He went there, not to touch, but to attend. The pianoforte, with its fallboard now lowered, took on a hermit's restraint. The Florentine casket sat upon it, its tiny lock like a mole on pale skin. Alleyn stood a moment and looked past his reflection to the clock with its braided loop. A little indentation showed in the braid silk, a vacancy where the ivory key had hung for years, except tonight. Ritual had flinched. It was not melodrama. It was as if someone had coughed during grace. He noted it and, very softly, closed the door, taking with him the slight, persistent scent of lilies that Lady Honoria did not favor after dark. Alleyn asked for the dining room when the house had recovered its silence. Lady Honoria, very straight in her chair and very pale, inclined her head. Cobb, with the caution of a man stepping backward out of a room of breakables, led the way. Fox followed, bulky and gentle-footed. The table had been cleared and tidied to an impersonal correctness. 2 candles guttered in their sockets and sent long, wavering shapes into the corners. Cobb switched on the sconces and stood, not quite at attention. "You will be kind enough," Alleyn said mildly, "to show me what you would call your routine. The end of dinner. Coffee to the music room. Port here, I think." "Yes, sir." Cobb's voice had that distant, velvet surface of good service. His late lordship preferred the gentleman to take port in the dining room. Lady Honoria keeps to his lordship's practice. "You warm the glasses?" "I do, sir. Over hot water, the star etched for the principal guest when I judge it proper. Sir Felix took it tonight." Alleyn's eye moved to the sideboard. On a small tray lay the decanter, stopped now, and a precise row of clean glasses, bowls downward. Between 2 of them, like a paler circle in the dark nap, was the faint outline of a ring where another glass had stood a considerate while and been lifted. He touched the nap with a fingertip. "A gentleman who changed his mind," he suggested. "I cannot say, sir. There were 5 gentlemen at table if we include Dr. Venn and Mr. Gray. I set 5 port glasses and 1 apart." "Why apart?" "For Mr. Piers Ashe, sir. He told me in a jocular manner that port was retrograde and would have a taste for fashion's sake if he changed his mind." He did not. Fox made a notation, and Cobb watched the movement as if it had been a gun raised. "The decanter, if you please," Alleyn said. Cobb lifted it by the neck and presented it carefully. The silver collar had been polished to an anonymous brightness. The stopper, when Alleyn drew it, gave with a soft sigh and a fragrance like a mellowed shadow. He returned it and looked at the way Cobb placed it. The handle aligned at a clean right angle to the table edge, the stopper forward, the label's tiny chain exactly parallel with the napkin's hem. "You're a man for lines," Alleyn said. "If I may, sir," Cobb murmured. "Then tell me why, earlier, the stopper sat crossways and the label's chain was kinked." Cobb's carefully nourished color changed. "Not by me, sir." "No," Alleyn said. "I didn't think so." He put the decanter down and took in, again, the small pale ring on the nap, a ghost of warmth that had printed itself, and then cooled. He looked at the star-etched glass, polished and innocent, the faintest bloom of heat still upon it from where Cobb had remembered to warm, even the unused. "After coffee," he said, "Sir Felix showed the house his party trick." Cobb stiffened almost imperceptibly. He admired the escritoire, sir. "Admired it and unlocked it with Lady Honoria's ivory key. I should like to see the place." They went by a passage where the floorboards kept their counsel beneath good carpeting and came into the library. Here the light fell kindly upon old bindings and the fair severities of Regency lines. Over in the corner, the escritoire stood, its lid down. Above it, on the walnut, a small brass hook had left its outline in dust, an oval of pale wood shaped by years of hanging. It was empty now. On the escritoire's fall, darkly gleaming, there was, surprisingly, a tiny crescent-shaped stain, the exact diameter of a port-glass foot. Alleyn did not immediately touch it. He looked at Cobb. "I don't allow glasses on the furniture, sir," Cobb said, as if someone had struck him in his private creed. "Not in my time?" "No," Alleyn agreed. "It's against the ritual." He bent and, with a flick of his nail, lifted from the edge of the brass lock plate a filament of black silk. It clung, resisting as if it had been caught and worried. He placed it on the pad of his thumb. The ivory key lay, where they had left it earlier, on the music room stand. He had looked at it then and not liked the way a bow had been tied in its ribbon, clumsy and reversed. Cobb's tie, he remembered, had been a neat, right-handed affair. The same muscle memory would have knotted the ribbon with the same precision. "Who returns the key ordinarily?" he asked. "I do, sir, after Sir Felix has done. I put it back directly when her ladyship rings for the coffee to be cleared. The key's kept hung from the hook. One doesn't lay it about." "One doesn't," Alleyn said. "Tonight you did not." Cobb's mouth tightened before the words. "No, sir." "And Sir Felix?" Alleyn asked. "Did he drink port at the escritoire?" "Sir Felix?" Cobb was shocked. "Never." Alleyn straightened, rested his hand for a moment over the small half-moon of port as though feeling the ghost of warmth there, and then moved away. He crossed to the mantel where a French clock made its discreet, comfortable noises. "You wind it?" he asked. "At 11, sir." "It has stopped and been started," Alleyn said, very matter-of-fact. "Look, Fox, the key scar is fresh in the brass, and the pendulum beat is irregular. Someone interrupted the habit." He turned back to the escritoire. Dust had a language, and tonight it had written, in faint capitals, the words of a person who had attempted to behave as if he belonged in the ritual and missed by half an inch. A glass where no glass ought to be, a ribbon tied with the simple wrongness of an imitator, a decanter replaced by a hand without the butler's fastidious geometry. When they returned to the corridor, they met Ellen, the parlour maid, with a message trembling on her tongue and correct speech laboriously trapping it. "If you please, sir, Inspector, there's a note just come by messenger for Miss Ventnor. Mr. Ashe took it in himself." "Thank you," Alleyn said. "Will you say to Mr. Ashe that I'll see him, and—" "Ellen—" "Yes, sir." "Did you see who put the glass on the escritoire?" Her eyes widened, then composed themselves. "No, sir," she said. "We don't put glasses on the furniture." "Quite," said Alleyn. "We don't." The house had settled into that strained composure which follows a day of managed shock. Lamps were shaded. The staircase wore its ribbon of muted light. Voices, when they came, were sanded down to civility. The rain, which had made a soft noise on the glass dome of the winter garden since afternoon, softened further, as if the weather, too, had entered into the pact of discretion. Alleyn, who had made a show of withdrawing to the library with a sheaf of notes and a shabby-looking book on Renaissance domestic objects, did not turn a page. He listened to the house. There are registers of anxiety that houses keep, like instruments in a closed orchestra. Servants, for example, cultivate a privacy punctuated by the indrawn breath of a footfall prematurely checked or the cautious cling of a door familiar with its latch. Guests, if they stay on, converse as if under a painted ceiling. It was so now. He thought again of the key, ivory, yellowed where the hand would have warmed it for generations, with a little fluted handle carved in the shape of a miniature column. It had been hung, as was usual in that house, on a silk cord behind the inner panel of the writing desk in the morning room. He had asked that nothing be moved until the photographer had done, and he had noted with a kind of minor start that seldom betrayed itself that the cord, which always fell in a loop, had made earlier a tight line across the panel as if drawn and hastily replaced. Routine, perhaps, but routine was the grammar of the place, and mispunctuation mattered. At 10:30, the butler came to him with the soundless glide of his profession and a face decently composed. "Sir, a telegram for Miss Harcourt. The maid took it up. She is not in her room." "Not in her room?" "No, sir." "Who brought the wire?" "A boy from the post office, sir. Tibbets took it." The butler's eyes flicked elsewhere. There was more. "And?" Alleyn prompted. "There is a note in Miss Harcourt's sitting room, sir, on her blotter." A fractional hesitation. typed. If the house had breath, it held it now. Alleyn rose, replaced his pencil against the limp book, and followed the butler along the passage, where a watercolor of an Italian street glowed like a token of normal life. Miss Harcourt's rooms opened off a short corridor, freshly papered, with a vase of lilies that had the pallor of an obvious gesture. On the small writing table lay a sheet of paper, carefully centered. Alleyn did not touch it until he had taken out his handkerchief. He read, "If you wish to avoid scandal, you will bring the Ivory Key to the Winter Garden at 11. Come alone. Do not inform the police. You are observed." It was a tidy piece of typing, with that faint slur on the S which he had seen on a letter in the dead man's file. So, a private summons in a public house. He folded the note in upon itself with an economy of movement and looked once round the room. A cloak was gone from its peg. The fire was reluctantly in. "Which maid came up with the wire?" he asked. "Tibbets, sir." "Tibbets is new." "A year, sir. Steady. Says she left the wire on Miss Harcourt's tray." The butler's tone added, without words, that the maid was never quite sure where trays ended and words began. "Very well. Ask Mr. Fox to wait in the hall and to intercept anyone leaving by the front, with civility. And you, if you please, will see that no one goes out through the mews." "Very good, sir." Alleyn took the back stair. It had an honest creak in it and smelt faintly of beeswax and hot pipes. The winter garden lay low in the plan of the house, a glazed box tacked to the drawing-room at the level of the terrace. Even in the rain-softened dark, it made its own climate. When he opened the door, the warm damp met him with a shy breath of soil and fern. Somewhere, a small fountain dripped, patient and unamazed. He did not put on the lights. There was enough under glass, from the street lamps finding their way through the leaves to make a mild enclosed dawn. A faint movement sounded among the palms, and he said, gently, "Miss Harcourt." A figure separated itself with the hesitancy of shame. The girl, she had in the afternoon had that brilliant, inexpert gaiety which passes for rank in certain circles, now looked as if she had gone down a long stone stair and felt the cold through her thin shoes. She held her cloak tight. "Inspector, It appears," he said, as if remarking on the weather, "that your correspondent took a liberty in my name." "I didn't tell anyone," she said quickly. "I thought," he said, "oh, I'm not a fool, you know, only—" She stopped. "No," said Alleyn. He moved his head a fraction. "And the key?" Her hand opened over the stone seat along the central path. Something pale lay there, an ivory crescent catching what light there was, with the faint sheen that old things acquire under the skin. He did not reach for it. "You didn't bring it," he said. "I didn't have it," she returned with a little fierce pride. "I never had it. The note. There was also a telegram. My mother ill. It wasn't true. I telephoned. I thought, if I came, if I pleaded—" Her voice broke. "I thought perhaps he would give me back my letters." "Ah," said Alleyn, and even in the half-light she looked astonished at herself for the admission. "And you were to come alone, of course." They both heard at the same moment the slight intake of breath that belongs to a concealed witness who has forgotten to breathe. It came from behind the thick-leaved camellia near the fountain. Alleyn did not move his hands or his head. He said, with a politeness that was itself a small net, "It is cold work overhearing, isn't it? Perhaps you would join us." There was no rustle, only a pause in which a large silence seemed to consider its position and, reluctantly, give way. Then a man stepped out. He was one of those present all day and all evening without ever being noticed. The secretary, or something very like a secretary. He had the sleek, careful look of one who keeps the difficult books. "I came," he said, and in the careful voice there was a thread of anger, "because I, too, had a note." "Typed?" asked Alleyn, without surprise. "Yes. And the key?" The man's eyes moved to the pale object on the stone. "I didn't bring it," he said. "No," Alleyn agreed. "It appears it has come to us instead." He put out his hand, then, at last, with a handkerchief between skin and ivory, and lifted the key. It lay like a small confession on linen. "Whoever sent for you," he said, and it was to both of them, "wished us to find this without asking who held it. A thoughtful impulse. Let us be equally considerate and go in by the side door. We shall talk very quietly in the morning room." As they moved, the fountain resumed its patient count. The rain outside agreed to continue for another hour. The house, feeling the key pass under its roof, adjusted itself to a new, almost imperceptible pitch. Alleyn sat for a time alone in the little morning room that looked upon the yew walk. The house had resumed its cultivated quiet, which was not the same as peace. One of the maids went past, carrying a folded cloth as if it were a confidential message. A door closed at the far end of the passage with a courtesy that made no noise at all. In the grate, the fire settled itself and let down a small column of ash. He held the forgery between finger and thumb, if forgery it was. The type was indecisive, a faintly bruised E and a T with a jaded foot. Miss Vale's Remington, if one must hedge the matter with initial conjectures, had an R that printed like a tossed pebble, more splash than roundness. He thought of her when she spoke of letters, eyes lowered, hands quiet as lids over porcelain. She had taken the shock of the afternoon with propriety, and then, much later, had turned white and clung to a chair back as if under a private wind. Afterward, she apologized to Lady Honoria and to everyone else for the inconvenience of her faintness. That apology was its own unspoken chapter. He replaced the paper in its envelope and put it away. He did not, yet, wish the house to know he had kept it. Fox, with a careful tread belying his weight, came halfway into the room and stopped when he saw Alleyn's expression. "Well?" Alleyn asked. "Dr. Temple's notes, sir." Fox offered a thin sheaf. "No gross lesion. He'd favor something introduced rather than innate. He's sent what there is to your people. I've told them to come and go by the tradesman's entrance." "Good," said Alleyn. "No need to interrupt the rites of dinner." Fox cleared his throat, which was his way of introducing a minor impudence. "They've put off dinner, sir. The chef is in a position of what you might call moral distress." "Are you interviewing the chef, Brer Fox?" "Not yet, sir. I thought you'd prefer the upper room seen to first." Alleyn nodded. "The study yields very little. The brandy is in the same condition as its stand, which is to say, plotlessly immaculate. Still, the glass that had been on the writing table is polished outside with more devotion than inside. Perrin will swear he applies devotion evenly. And somewhere between broken habit and tidiness, we produce a shadow." He said nothing for a moment, remembering the study, the degree to which the blotter was placed centrally, the way a second chair stood just off square, the pen lid pushed half on as if thought had been paused rather than finished. He had moved nothing, photographed everything. The late man's face had not been dramatic. A little fallen in, perhaps. No struggle in it. Something like inconvenient surprise. "The harpsichord," said Fox, who had learned the progress of Alleyn's thoughts was sometimes audible. "I've got your note here. Mr. Dart says he closed it himself after the recital. The lid, I mean." "And yet," Alleyn said, "someone opened it again. The satin ribbon round the music, what do they call it, was at a neat angle earlier. Afterward, one end was torn." Miss Grey's small fingers are not in question there. She has a pretty respect for property. Mr. Dart's hands, on the other hand, no pun, Fox, are too emphatic to make such a minuscule mischief. It would be our discreet person. "Miss Vale," Fox suggested, as neutrally as he could. "Or Lady Honoria," said Alleyn. "Or Captain Ardmore, who carries his misfortunes as if they might break the furniture. Or Colonel Sutcliffe, who talks of campaigns but walks like a man counting his steps to the safe. The painters and actors are less likely near such a box. Familiarity makes them diffident. Fox did not smile. He was beginning to enjoy the house in the way of a man who knew it had secrets but would not invite him to the table. "And the key?" he said. Alleyn looked past him into his own thought. The little key of ivory, pretty as a conceit, carved to fit the hidden lock under the keyboard, had reappeared after an absence of a day and a half, about which no one felt perfectly at ease. So much had been made of it, the dead man showing it earlier to the company, as if its prettiness could excuse its material. The small homily upon ancient wrong, the rather pious return of it to the instrument when the applause subsided. Miss Vale had keyed that episode into the household routine as if it were any other trifle. The routine had then mislaid itself. "It is there," said Alleyn, "and yet the impression remains that it has travelled." "Mr. Perrine says it never leaves the room." "Mr. Perrine says many useful things because he has trained himself to do so," said Alleyn. "He knows what must be said to preserve the taller structures. We'll not topple them, but we will look beneath the lintels." Fox produced one more piece of information. "There's a gardener, sir. Caudle. He saw a light in the pavilion about 11:30. He thought it was Lady Honoria and went away again because he didn't wish to make her uncomfortable by being seen." "Ah," said Alleyn, as if the garden had explained something to him. "The pavilion, of course." He was silent. To Fox he seemed to become, for a moment, part of the furniture of the morning room, a well-made chair, a piece of reliable lacquer in a world that liked its ornaments to be sound. "When we talk to them again," he said at last, "we will not ask them what they did, but what they would have done if other people had been different. They will tell us and not perceive that they have done so." "And the letter, sir?" "Leave it with me," Alleyn said. He stood. "We'll take the servants now, not to force anything. People who are careful about others' reputations often leave their own unattended." He went out, moving softly as if not to wake a sleeper. In the corridor, the tall clock, wound at 8 each evening by Perrin's hands, ticked with an indifferent regularity, as if to say that ritual had been observed and something else had failed. They gathered without prompting. It was late, and the lamps in the green drawing-room diluted themselves against the mirrors so that the people in the room were reflected as paler, more careful versions of themselves. The rain, which had fretted at the window panes all afternoon, had spent itself. The house lay in a tired hush that seemed to ask, not for rest, but for decorum. Alleyn had asked for nothing formal. He had merely drifted, as it were, to the hearthrug after a few unimportant words with the superintendent, and when Lady Harriet, one hand still on the back of the chair she had not yet taken, said that they were at his disposal, he lifted a hand and smiled with a faint apology. There was no semicircle, no accusation. The chairs were where they had been left after dinner. The butler had removed the coffee tray. "May I be permitted," said Alleyn, "to impose upon the room one minor disorder?" Lady Harriet inclined her head. She had the air of a woman whose poise was a garment shaken by a sudden wind and hastily smoothed. Alleyn set a small object upon the low table by the hearth. It made the softest of sounds against the polished wood. It was the ivory key. He did not look at it after he had put it down. He stood where the fire could have warmed his back had he allowed it. His hands were loosely joined, his gaze somewhere between the lamp and the rug. "There are houses," he said easily, "in which everything can be predicted. One might imagine it tedious. It is, on the contrary, a relief. One is at peace among laws. In such houses the windows are opened at the same hour, flowers changed before luncheon, decanters stopped, clocks wound. One might suppose that routine is an enemy of imagination, but it is also the guardian of innocence. Anything that wanders out of routine is a sort of trumpet." He glanced once, fleetingly, at the ivory key. The painter, who had been restless since dinner, pressed his lips together. The secretary's head was slightly bowed, as if listening to some distant conversation in his own mind. The young woman, Lady Harriet's niece, sat with both hands clenched on the arms of her chair in an attitude she would later consider theatrical and abandon. "The letter," Alleyn went on, very mildly, "which asked for an interview, and the minute in which it arrived. The bell that was rung from the music room, though at that hour it is never rung because the footmen are changing their coats. The cabinet that is never left unlocked. The key that is never present in the cabinet at all, but kept with the silver. You will forgive me, Lady Harriet. Mr. Pym told me as much when I bothered him with his plate lists." Lady Harriet made a small, acquiescent movement. "I've tried," said Alleyn, "without badgering, to learn what belongs to this house. It is difficult to do so without the house's consent. It has been very kind. More kind, perhaps, than some of those who live within it. That is not a rebuke, merely an observation. We are all economical with our truths." The brigadier cleared his throat. "Dash it all," he said, and then, remembering himself, "Forgive me, Lady Harriet. This is most trying." "It is," Alleyn agreed, "and will be so a very little longer. May I be allowed to put a small proposition before you?" No one spoke. He picked up the key with 2 fingers and a delicate preoccupation, as if he were careful not to smudge what might be no more than a memory on its pale surface. "This," he said, "does not open what it promises to open. In that, it is like certain letters. I do not say it is a symbol, because symbols, like the theatre, have their own dangers. But tonight, in the music room, there was a time when one might reasonably expect a certain door to be opened and another, quite different, to remain shut. We have, instead, a reversal. It is curious how often reversals are contrived by those who have lived long in the company of habit." The actress, who had carried her fatigue all evening like a slight, expensive perfume, said, "Must we hear the end now, Inspector?" There was impatience, and, under it, unease. He turned to her with that courteous, scrupulous attention that made impatience absurd. "No," he said, "not the end. I thought we might hear the beginning of the end, which is to say, the beginning as the person concerned would have liked it to be read. There was, I think, an intention to avoid any scene. I am anxious to respect it." The secretary looked up quickly. The niece's mouth trembled and steadied. Mr. Pym, at the door, stood with that absolute stillness which is the professional expression of sympathy. Had the interview occurred as planned, Alleyn went on, it would have been brief. An old disagreement, a newer difficulty, something that could be adjusted with a private word and a gesture toward the future. In that mood, one would go to the music room alone. One would unlock the cabinet, forgetting for once that the key does not belong there, and one would find either a letter waiting where no letter should be, or an object placed with a primness that betrays it. "Inspector," said Lady Harriet, "do forgive me. Do you assert, then?" "I assert only that we are dealing with a person who knows where things are kept. Not merely where they are kept officially, but where they are kept when the house is itself. There is almost a tenderness in such knowledge." He set the key down again. It lay, absurdly white, between the vases. The lamplight, caught by its smoothness, made a tiny, moon-like shine. "I do not propose," said Alleyn, and the courteous voice was just a little firmer, "to pursue this in company. I dislike it. If I may, I will ask 2 people to give me 5 minutes. The rest of you, I hope, will go to your rooms." He named them. The names in that room were like a draught of colder air, the secretary and Lady Harriet's niece. The brigadier moved as if to protest and checked himself. The actress closed her eyes and opened them again. The painter gave an odd, almost comic little laugh, which he smothered with his hand. "Thank you," said Alleyn, and his courtesy had deepened to something like gravity. "I am very much obliged." He lifted the key once more, as lightly as one might lift a feather from a pillow, and with that small object in his palm, moved to the door. The two he had named rose without being asked. The drawing-room resumed its quiet. Only the fire, settling itself, made from time to time that tiny conversational sound which sometimes persuades one that houses talk when we are not listening. Lady Honoria's morning room had been drawn as one draws breath after shock. The fire banked low, the curtains not quite closed, the great grey portrait above the mantel looking down with a blandity that gave no counsel. Alleyn thought the room had a quality he often found at the end of these affairs, a sense of inanimate tact, as if the objects understood and had arranged themselves to a gentler aspect. Mr. Graves, who had shown them in, vanished with the same discretion. They were few. Lady Honoria, in a chair that seemed to have risen under her, as a wave lifts a swimmer. Oliver Pardoe stiffly upright on the edge of a stool. Miranda Dacre, present as if by accident, her hands bunched into the folds of her skirt. Fox in a corner, quiet and plain as a paper knife. And Miss Harcourt standing behind her employer's chair with the unobtrusive exactness of habit. On the small table lay the ivory key. Its pale length seemed to return the firelight with a self-sufficient glow. The teeth were delicately cut, and the shank wore, near its head, a faint discoloration like the shadow of a ribbon long since unfastened. Alleyn, who had been trained by life and work to make no movement that might bruise feeling, set his fingertips on the chair back before him and said, "I'm afraid I must take advantage of Lady Honoria's patience. There are 2 or 3 loose ends, and then there need be no more." Lady Honoria's head moved once, a bow to ceremony. "The first," said Alleyn, "is very small. Lady Honoria has a way with that key. She replaces it on the green velvet with the teeth pointing to the left." Mr. Graves observed quietly that on the night Mr. Arden died, it lay with its teeth to the right. Mr. Pardoe stirred. Miss Harcourt, behind the chair, did not. "The second is also small," Alleyn continued. "A note was sent to Mr. Arden, asking him to come to the library alone. It purported to be yours, ma'am." It was not. We recognized the machine, or rather, what the machine had been taught to do. That peculiarity of the R. It is one of those faint private signatures that attach to objects used every day by one person. It is hard to counterfeit and harder to miss when you know it. Miranda Dacre looked at Miss Harcourt, then at Alleyn. "But anyone could have borrowed my machine," she began, with a confusion that earned her from Lady Honoria a glance so composed it quieted her. "There is a third irrelevance," said Alleyn. "A decanter stopper in the wrong decanter. Mr. Graves's ritual does not include mistakes. He is an old-fashioned servant, and his world is measured in small, unbroken habits. When a habit is broken, it is either a crisis or an intrusion. That night, it was an intrusion. The brandy decanter was not where his hand expected to find it." Miss Harcourt's hands had folded. They were the neat, well-kept hands of a woman who writes for other people and is careful not to smudge. There was, on the right index finger, a faint roughness which Alleyn had noticed earlier when she handed him an envelope. It had not interested him then. It did now. "Lastly," he said, "there is a matter of botany. The foxgloves in the winter garden were cut back." He turned to Lady Honoria. "You spoke with some regret of that, ma'am, and said you had hoped to force a late bloom. Miss Harcourt, I think, cut those stalks." Mr. Graves noticed petals in the waste-paper basket of the little office and was too discreet to speak. "Graves," Lady Honoria said, scarcely above breath. "He told me when I asked him what he had noticed." "Not what he knew," Alleyn said. "He is loyal to the house." Miss Harcourt's voice, when it came, was so even that it must have cost her effort. "Will you say it, Inspector, and have done?" Alleyn inclined his head. "You opened the Florentine casket with the ivory key and took out the letters that would have ruined Lady Honoria. You asked Mr. Arden to meet you in the library under the pretext of a private settlement. You poured him brandy, very little, and touched it with a strong infusion of digitalis. You counted, perhaps, upon frightening him. Perhaps you'd already frightened yourself. You replaced the stopper and the key, but not as Mr. Graves would have replaced them. You are not Mr. Graves." Miranda said, "Oh," on a note that was not surprise but recognition. Oliver Pardo put a hand up to the side of his face. Lady Honoria's voice, when it sounded, had the inflection of a woman who has rehearsed her composure for years. "Why, Celia?" Miss Harcourt moved then. Not forward, if anything, inward, as if some inward muscle relaxed and allowed her to take up less space. "Because Mr. Arden would not be bought and would not be merciful. I believed he would bargain until there was nothing left. I thought if he were very ill, he would keep away. He had a weak heart. He said so often enough. I am not a poisoner, Lady Honoria. I made a great deal of reading, and I brewed too strong. That is the truth of it." She lifted her eyes to Alleyn. "That is what you mean me to say, isn't it?" "I mean you to say what you can bear to say," Alleyn answered. There was a very long pause. In it, the small noises of the room became precise. A coal shifted. The clock changed its mind about a second. A taxi slowed and went away. Lady Honoria stared, not at Miss Harcourt, nor at Alleyn, but at the Ivory Key. "It is preposterous," Oliver Pardo said, because he could think of nothing else. "Miss Harcourt is Miss Harcourt." "Yes," said Lady Honoria, and her mouth made the ghost of a smile. "There you are, Oliver. She is exactly Miss Harcourt." Fox, who had waited for his cue as a conscientious actor will, came forward and stood by the door. He did not touch Miss Harcourt. She did not move away. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you will be kind to her." Alleyn looked at Lady Honoria. There was a hardness in the older woman's eyes that was not cruelty but a defense against it. "Miss Harcourt," she said, "I have been served. Very well. I cannot advise you now. That must be in other hands." Miss Harcourt inclined her head. She reached for the ivory key, and when her hand came near it, she withdrew it with a little intake of breath, as if from heat. "No," she said softly, to herself rather than to them. "I won't touch it again." Ellen thought, irrelevantly, that the key's pallor was a kind of innocence the object could afford, being without memory. He asked her, very gently, to come with Fox. She went, passing behind Lady Honoria's chair as she had passed so many times, careful of its arm, that ordinary domestic scruple surviving the moment in an odd, piercing way. When the door closed, Lady Honoria drew one long, slow breath and let it go. "I am not grateful," she said. "I am merely older." Alleyn inclined his head. "It is almost over," he said, and knew that in another room, with a very plain table and a very plain chair, something else was beginning. He reached out, turned the ivory key so that its teeth looked left again, and waited for the second hand to find its way to the hour. The house settled into the pale hush that follows, not a storm, but the end of a long season that had only ever blown within. Outside, the lawns lay brittle with frost, and the cedar cast its old shadow as if nothing had altered under it in 100 years. Inside, doors were opened and shut with unusual consideration. The staff went on soft feet, and the party that had been kept at his request to witness the end of his recital of facts became the party that hovered in antechambers with a delicacy born of breeding and of fear. Alleyn stood by the morning-room fire and looked at the room as one might consider a stage after an unadvertised rehearsal. Mr. Fox, solid and companionable, waited at his shoulder. The pianist, Mr. Julian Armitage, sat very straight in the armchair they had indicated and showed a face on which nothing had been written except a scrupulous neatness. His hands were laid one upon the other as if they had found in stillness a posture not entirely unfamiliar. "Shall we?" Alleyn said, not unkindly. Julian rose. "If I might have my coat." He consulted the butler with a courteous, even courtly inclination. "Mr. Pembroke, you are good enough." Pembroke, who had known the habits of grief in many households and had dressed more than one guest who was to be spared the greater discomfort of showing emotion, brought the dark coat and the soft hat, and held them with the finesse that makes a ceremonial of service. "Sir," he said to Alleyn, his eyes touching an infinitesimal point behind the inspector's shoulder, and would have withdrawn. "Pembroke," Alleyn added, "the car will draw up at the postern gate. No one need be disturbed." "Very good, sir." Lady Honoria came in and stopped, not with surprise, but with a sort of careful courtesy to the moment. She was perfectly dressed and had contrived a pin at her throat, as if she had not had a night between the party and now. She went to Julian and held out a hand. "Mr. Armitage," she said very gently, "the house has no complaint to make of you. We are—" She seemed to check, to remember the law, to choose again. "We are sorry." "I doubt that you are," said Julian, and then, as if something less stiff had broken under his tone, "That is not fair. You have been exact." She took this without change of face and turned to Alleyn. "Inspector, Major Carfax persists in imagining his testimony should be revised. In the library, he is composing a more gallant version of his conduct. I dare say you will know how to take him." "Thank you. Mr. Fox will do what is needed." He glanced at his colleague, who moved away with his mild expression and his enormous steadiness. "May I go through the music room?" Julian asked. "It would be—" His eyes flicked, not pleading, to the inner door. Alleyn saw no harm in a corridor of familiar furniture. "Come." They crossed into the music room. The instrument, gleaming and pale, showed the small wound on one of its ivory fronts where a chip had gone in some other century. A lily, which had not yet lost its polish, bent toward the music stand and seemed to smell of nothing at all. Julian went close and laid his fingers upon the keys, not pressing, merely covering them as if to bless a thing that would no longer be necessary. For an instant the hands hovered, and Alleyn, who knew nothing of technique, felt a sensation that was not pity so much as recognition, that men do not leave their chosen tools without some ending. He thought of the teacup and the neatness of a lethal precaution, of the little ivory key on its ribbon, out of place, later wiped conscientiously, and of a passion for order, wrongly applied. "I have tried," Julian said, looking at the instrument and not at him, "to keep the interval between one note and the next. It is not possible." "No," said Alleyn, "not after you alter the scale." Julian's shoulders made the smallest movement. "You have an ear, Inspector. Not trained, perhaps, but—" He stopped. The sentence had been a gift, and he had found it inappropriate. There were steps behind them. Miss Dacre came as far as the threshold and halted beautifully with her actress's stillness. She was pale in a becoming way, and her lips had the faint, displeased droop of a lady who has been required to see too much. "Mr. Armitage," she said, "you will forgive me if I do not make the customary speech." "Of course," Julian answered. "Because it would have been untrue," she added, more to herself. "We live on truthful falsehoods, don't we?" She turned her head toward Alleyn. "I suppose that is libellous of my profession. You will forgive me too." "There is very little to forgive," Alleyn said. "Mr. Fox will want a few moments with you, Miss Dacre. Then I think you are at liberty." She made a little bow and went away lightly, as if a trap had been sprung behind her and had not caught her. Julian took up the hat. "Inspector," he said, "I should prefer—" "No, that would seem melodramatic, and I do not think you have much patience with melodrama." "You are wrong," Alleyn said. "In the theatre, it is indispensable. In this room, not." In the outer hall, Felix, young, nervous, with the exhausted bravado of a boy who has outstayed the party, stood and watched them. He lifted a hand, let it fall, and then, with that eagerness that is not courage but wishes to look like it, stepped forward. "Julian, Mr. Armitage, if there is anything—" "There is not," Julian said, and very quietly, "There has been too much." Mr. Pembroke opened the side door. Cold air came in, clean as paper. The policeman at the gate took his cap off in an old fashion of respect that has not been entirely trained out of the force. Julian crossed the threshold and did not look back. It would have been vulgar to look back. Alleyn paused, his hand on the jamb. Lady Honoria's voice came once more, composed, unchanging. "Inspector," she said, "the exhibition shall be closed for the time being. The key to the cabinet—" "Mr. Fox has it," Alleyn told her. "It will be returned when it is only a key." "Will it ever be that?" she asked, and gave him for the first time a glance that suggested she had allowed herself to be touched. "It is what keys are," he said. "It is we who give them doors." He followed the others down the passage, and the house resumed its cultivated silence as if nothing had ever been other than arranged. Outside, the car moved away without haste. In the cedar's long shadow, the gravel bore. For a moment, the faint print of a man who had walked as if he had learned early not to disturb the stage. Then even that was gone. They came at his quiet request, and they came without fuss. The music room had been put to rights, the lamps shaded, the Bechstein closed with its soft gleam, the faint aroma of wax and orchids persisting like the memory of a composition. Alleyn stood with his back to the fire and waited while Lady Isabel took the nearest chair, very straight and colourless. Miss Vane remained by the console table as if it might presently be required of her. Julian Ferrers, pale and over-scrubbed, hovered by the window. Felix Lanyard found himself a shadowed corner and made a tent of his hands. General Markham did not sit. Crewe, having placed a tray with a jug and glasses on the low table, receded to the door and stayed there, unobtrusive as a bracket. "I shan't be long," Alleyn said. "It occurs to me that we have travelled rather a distance tonight without appearing to move. Perhaps we may agree the journey is done." No one spoke. The clock, fastidiously wound by Crewe's hand, shaped the room's silence into crisp segments. "Lord Brackenhurst died," said Alleyn, "almost certainly within 5 minutes of 9. The doctor's first opinion spoke of the heart. He was not wrong. A heart can be stilled by a number of agencies. In this case, a dose of digitalis, sufficient to calm the organ into its last docility, was slipped into his nightly draught. You all know the bromide and barley ritual. One could set one's watch by it. He preferred to take it here, settling himself, I think, with a page of Molière and a line or two of Schubert. A pleasant habit and, as it happens, an excellent disguise." General Markham said, "Good God," rather softly, and looked at Julian as if the young man's thin wrists might have poured the stuff. Julian stared at the black panes. "Ritual," Alleyn went on, "is a consoling thing, but it is merciless to the one who tampers with it. There is, for instance, the matter of the key, the small ivory key that opens the Regency cabinet. I am told it has lived for years upon a blue cord on the music stand, coming to rest each evening on the little red lacquer dish beside that Chinese paper knife. It is brought there by Crewe when he closes the room at 8:30 and replaced by him at 11. Tonight it was on the dish at 7. Miss Vane's lashes moved. Crewe, impassive, did not. "I saw it," Alleyn said. "I remembered it because, like many objects to which a household assigns importance, it has acquired a faint mythology. One is warned not to mislay it. One passes it on with a small ceremony. And yet by 7, it had already been given its emeritus position for the night. That was our first crack. The second, a note. Lord Brackenhurst's drawer held a square of paper in Lady Isabel's hand, requesting he come here at 9 to discuss a draft codicil. Ladyship wrote no such note. The paper was old. Paris watermark, as it happens. Only one person in this room has the habit of repairing to the morning-room escritoire for such stationery and of carrying a key with her for the drawers wherein personal papers are kept. Miss Vane did not look up. "It is my employment," she said, in a voice that neither denied nor confirmed. "Precisely. Your employment," Alleyn agreed. to guard routine, and to know how to use it. You sent that note in Lady Isabel's hand, one of those trifles a competent secretary learns impeccably. You had the opportunity to alter the barley mixture earlier. Crew's relief at 7 allowed you the room. You replaced the Ivory Key because you had taken it, earlier in the day, to fetch out a folder that should never be looked into by anyone but the owner. You put it back too soon. I dare say you told yourself you were saving Crew a step. But you altered the liturgy of this house, Miss Vane. You did it for love. At love, Lady Isabel's head moved slightly, as if a draught had touched her. She looked not at Miss Vane, but at the piano. I wondered, Alleyn said very gently, whether you would try to shift the weight. The forged telegram to my sergeant, meant to send him to Tunbridge Wells after a non-existent witness, was not quite in your line. It smelt of a different mind. But the rest is yours. You could not bear that the codicil should be signed. It would have stripped Lady Isabel of authority in her own house and left Julian dependent upon the niggardly mercies of a trust you did not trust. Miss Vane's hands, folded as they always were, tightened until the knuckles shone. He had no right, she said, and only then looked at Lady Isabel. Forgive me. I could not let him break you. He had no right. None. The right of law and of ownership, General Markham muttered, but it was an aside made to order the air, not to cudgel. Alleyn said, "It is not my business to sort your hearts, only your acts. You could have gone to the courts. You chose to dispense with them. You knew his dose. You altered it. You opened the cabinet to remove the draft codicil and, perhaps, letters which would have added sting to humiliation. You burned papers cleanly, Miss Vane. You did so tonight, and it nearly passed, except that you put the Ivory Key to bed too early." There was a small sound, like a thread breaking. Miss Vane's face changed in a way that seemed to age it not by years, but by resignation. "If you please," she said to Crew with a pale, apologetic smile, "the black coat, for Lady Isabel's sake." Lady Isabel rose. "Elvira," she said, and the single name held abolished distances. "Must you?" "I must," Miss Vane answered. "It was my choice, not yours. You will be kind to Julian. He's very young." She steadied herself, looked around the room as if to take the measure of it once more in this corrected perspective, and held out her hands. Fox came in without noise, as if the house itself had telegraphed him that the moment required no boots. There was no hustle, no raised voice. The door closed on small sounds. Afterwards, Alleyn walked to the Bechstein and lifted the cover. He touched an Ivory Key very lightly, and it gave back a note as modest as a breath. Lady Isabel stood where she had stood. "He was not a monster," she said, as if arguing with a friend. "He was merely himself." "Yes," said Alleyn, "and Miss Vane was merely herself. The law will do what it can. The rest is beyond us." When he left, the rain had stopped, and the gravel at Brackenhurst held a thin glitter that would pass by morning. He thought, absurdly, of the little key on its blue cord and of the way habit tries to keep us safe, and how the heart, which cannot be argued with, betrays and is betrayed in turn. He did not look back at the house. It would resume its ritual. It always did.